There's no need to sugarcoat it. North Korea's supreme leader Kim Jong Un is no stranger to inflammatory rhetoric and threats of war. The same goes for numerous acts of provocation aiming to assert dominance and project strength on a global stage. Think of these actions as rungs on an escalation ladder Kim keeps climbing. They are worrisome, but stop short of a full-scale conflict, or at least they did in the past. The current circumstances suggest that Kim might be ready to climb all the way to the top rung and start an all-out war. But waiting for him, hoping for the best but preparing for the worst, is South Korea and its current leader Yoon Suk-yeol. But what makes us think Kim is ready to make this dangerous leap? After all, Kim's previous amped-up yet essentially empty saber-rattling has never been seen as a precursor of actual conflict, just as a facade for his regime's incompetence and insecurity. Well, recent events suggest a departure from this well-known pattern. It's what led two leading experts on North Korea, Robert L. Carlin and Siegfried S. to publish an article in January 2024 unambiguously stating that Kim has decided to start a war. To quote them directly, "The situation on the Korean peninsula is more dangerous than it's been at any time since early June 1950. That may sound overly dramatic, but we believe, like his grandfather in 1950, Kim Jong Un has made a strategic decision to go to war." These words caused shockwaves in the community of North Korean watchers, prompting many to respond with their own speculations, theories, and rebuttals. But above all else, this article raised numerous questions. Why would North Korea attack South Korea? How will Kim do it? And is there anything that could stop this cataclysmic scenario from taking place? These are just some of the questions that plague the minds of analysts, policymakers, and regular people alike as they grapple with the sobering possibility of a conflict on the Korean peninsula, and let's face it, on the global stage. These are also the questions that will be answered in this video. Let's start with why Kim would choose to start a war with South Korea. Keep in mind that the word choice here is intentional. We're not discussing actions and circumstances that tell us that North Korea would attack South Korea. For now, we're only focusing on what led Kim to even make this decision and vow to annihilate South Korea if provoked. Given what's at stake here, it shouldn't be surprising that there are several possible factors pushing Kim up the escalation ladder. The first might surprise you, as it has nothing to do with South Korea. However, numerous experts tie the current unprecedented rise in tensions to a singular event: the 2019 North Korea-United States Hanoi Summit. Picture this: Kim poured all his prestige into the Hanoi summit. He even traveled by train for 60 hours from Pyongyang to Vietnam's capital to meet his interlocutor, President Donald Trump. Before the summit, he showered the then US president with flattery, reportedly referring to him as Your Excellency in exchanged letters. And what did he get in return? 2 fruitless one-on-one meetings with Trump and a note urging him to surrender all nuclear weapons. As you can imagine, this didn't sit well with Kim, and the Hanoi summit was cut short. But the summit wasn't the only thing that abruptly ended on that fateful day in 2019. So did Kim's attempts to normalize relations with the US. You see, according to many experts, Carlin and included, the Hanoi summit was when Kim realized that this normalization that his grandfather Kim Il-sung envisioned and his father Kim Jong-il pursued for years was simply not achievable. He walked out of the Hanoi summit with a traumatic loss of face and a conviction that his international and regional goals can only be achieved through warfare. This single event has seemingly caused an historic swing in North Korea's foreign policy, one that could end up costing South Korea dearly. But why focus war efforts on South Korea? Isn't the US the one that wronged North Korea in Kim's eyes? Though the US undoubtedly ranks high on North Korea's enemy list, the #1 spot went to South Korea for a few reasons. Historical animosities, ideological differences, and the perception that South Korea is a puppet of the US are just some of the reasons. Another, arguably more important, is the fear of the so-called reunification by absorption, an approach adopted by Germany in 1990. Let us explain. When Germany's reunification took place, West Germany, the economically and militarily more powerful of the two, essentially absorbed East Germany, forcing it to adopt a new system and economy. It's quite clear who West Germany's counterpart is on the Korean peninsula. South Korea absolutely trumps North Korea when it comes to economic and military power. A few figures will be more than enough to illustrate the huge difference. The GDP of South Korea, whose official name is the Republic of Korea, was $1.7 trillion at the end of 2023, placing it among the top 15 largest economies in the world. During the same period, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea generated a GDP of only around $24.5 billion. That means South Korea's GDP is about 70 times bigger. Not to mention the 115 spots that separate the two Koreas on the list of the most powerful countries by GDP. The Global Firepower Index, an annual list ranking countries by military power, might not showcase a three-digit difference, but 31 spots is also a substantial gap. Based on military power, South Korea ranks 5th in the entire world, boasting an impressive number of active duty personnel, advanced weaponry, and a strong defense budget. North Korea, in contrast, sits in the 36th spot, with a bigger military force but far less advanced equipment and weaponry. Plus, let's not forget that South Korea has close ties to the US, something that North Korea is obviously not able to say. With these circumstances in mind, it's easy to conclude that South Korea absorbing North Korea is a highly likely scenario for reunification. This scenario would also mean a total collapse of Kim's regime and a fundamental change in political, economic, and social structure of the Korean peninsula. But unsurprisingly, Kim is hell-bent on stopping this scenario from transpiring. Since North Korea sees South Korea as an existential threat, if reunification is to happen, it can only be under the terms of Kim's regime. In Kim's eyes, this goal justifies extreme measures. It justifies a war. However, Kim's major shift in policy and perceived danger coming from the South aren't the only reasons a war is on the horizon. Some experts believe Kim's decision has more to do with North Korea's domestic situation than any external threats. You see, the situation in North Korea is beyond alarming. It's been described as a devastating tragedy unfolding. North Korean people are starving to death. They're also being sentenced to hard labor or even executed for something as frivolous as watching US and South Korean TV shows. However, the first scenario is significantly more widespread, so much so that even Kim acknowledged it in a speech. Today, failure to satisfactorily provide the people in local areas with basic living necessities, including condiments, foodstuff, and consumption goods, has arisen as a serious political issue that our party and government can never sidestep. Interestingly, he blamed the terrible situation on North Korean economic institutions, which, in his words, have failed to find out realistic and revolutionary possibilities. It seems that the revolutionary possibility he came up with is waging an all-out war against South Korea, essentially diverting his people's attention from the dire living conditions by creating an external enemy. Positioning South Korea as the #1 enemy should also change the minds of people who are increasingly aware of how superior the country is to North Korea. It should also serve as an explanation as to why Kim is spending exorbitant amounts of money on missiles during such a difficult economic time. Speaking of missiles, a massive resurgence in missile activity in North Korea is also what prompted many analysts to conclude North Korea is gearing up for a war. Now, don't get us wrong, building missiles isn't anything new for North Korea. In fact, it's been a staple of North Korean leadership for some time. The same goes for conducting test launches to showcase their newest inventions, which they do frequently. But it would appear that the testing part of these launches is merely a facade. Quite tellingly, these tests always seem to coincide with major joint training exercises between the US and South Korea, or key political events in the latter country. For instance, in April 2024, North Korea test-fired a suspected intermediate-range ballistic missile into its eastern waters, flying it for roughly 400 miles at a maximum altitude of 62 miles. This firing comes just a few days before South Korea's nationwide elections on April 10th. Now, we wouldn't blame you for thinking that Kim just has an issue with democracy in general. However, in this case, his actions have more to do with a specific, democratically chosen representative, South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol. During his 2 years in office, Yoon has taken a hard line against North Korea, and the April elections should show just how much support this approach has garnered him. As you can imagine, Kim hopes to undermine this support by any means possible, hence the missiles. But let's go back to the US-South Korean military exercises for a second. After all, stopping these exercises is a major goal of Kim's regime. Why? It's simple, really. Kim perceives these joint military exercises as a direct obstacle to his plans of reunification by force. The more exercises South Korea takes part in, the more well-trained its soldiers get. However, the fact that these are joint exercises with the US adds another dimension to his concerns. You see, joint fighting is one of the most challenging skills in military strategy. It requires seamless coordination, communication, and interoperability between different military forces. By conducting joint exercises with the US, South Korea not only enhances its own military capabilities, but also strengthens its alliance with a major global superpower. The result? In case of any aggression against South Korea, North Korea would have to contend with the formidable military might of the US. So, the only way North Korea would be able to successfully attack South Korea would be to take the US out of the equation. With the US gone from the Korean peninsula, Kim would secure a much more level playing field for a potential crossing of the 38th parallel. But how could North Korea possibly evict the US from the Korean peninsula? Not with their military might, that's for sure. The only bargaining chip North Korea could have in this matter is its nuclear arsenal. This also ties into how North Korea would carry out a potential attack against South Korea. Though the North might boast a larger military by raw numbers, it certainly can't come close to the South's advanced weaponry, equipment, and evidently training. The only area where it's the other way around, the South can't compare with the North, is the nuclear arsenal. North Korea has an estimated 50 to 60 nuclear warheads, with some reports indicating that this number could be twice as high. South Korea has 0. If a total annihilation of South Korea is to happen, nuclear weapons seem like the most plausible means for North Korea to achieve this objective. Of course, if nuclear weapons were to be used in any capacity, that would likely result in catastrophic consequences, not just for South Korea, but for the entire region and potentially the world. That's why some experts believe that Kim has no intention of using nuclear weapons just yet. For now, he believes that the mere existence of these weapons and their occasional demonstration through testing is enough to deter the US from getting involved in the fight. After all, this involvement might signify certain death for roughly 25,000 US troops stationed in South Korea. However, the effectiveness of this strategy is subject to debate. Some experts claim that this strategy has actually backfired completely. But how? By making the US-South Korean alliance stronger against a common enemy and even adding a potential new member, Japan. After all, Japan is just east of the Korean peninsula, across the Korea Strait, granting the country a front-row seat to North Korea's aggressions. Other experts argue that North Korea doesn't have enough nuclear weapons for this so-called nuclear shadow strategy to work. The country would need at least 200 warheads to achieve the level of coercion and deterrence that Kim desires. But don't celebrate just yet. The current number of North Korean nukes is more than enough for Kim to get away with numerous hostile acts. Sending a team of infiltrators to conduct espionage, carrying out small-level sabotage against coastal infrastructure, and conducting open-water nuclear tests are just some examples. It ultimately comes down to how much risk Kim is willing to take, and since he believes that the global tides are running in his favor, these risks will probably only get increasingly bigger. The end goal? A full-scale war. But under the right circumstances. But what does Kim deem the right circumstances for war to be? And what are these favorable global tides he's referring to? The answers to these questions are also the answers to the titular question of this video: why will North Korea attack South Korea? Let's hypothesize that Kim decided to go to war in the aftermath of the disastrous Hanoi summit. For this war to go in his favor, he would have to wait for the right opportunity to attack. The first event that pushed North Korea closer toward a military solution to the Korean question was Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. As dark as this might sound, this invasion is one of the biggest things that's happened to Kim's regime. Why? Because it brought Russia and North Korea closer together. Prior to the invasion, Russia had sanctions against North Korea in place, following most of the guidelines set by the United Nations. However, as more and more countries turned their back on Russia due to its brazen aggression in Ukraine, the country's president Vladimir Putin had no option but to drop most of these sanctions. Of course, this was just the beginning. What ensued was a mutually beneficial trade deal between Russia and North Korea, where Russia provided much-needed economic support and military cooperation to Kim's regime in exchange for weapons and ammunition for Russia's war in Ukraine. The military cooperation primarily pertains to allowing North Korea access to Russian technology that can help boost the country's long-range firepower and satellite coverage. Plus, Russia threatened that it would no longer help preserve peace in the region if South Korea sent lethal aid to Ukraine. As Kim sees it, this is a win-win situation: more money to sustain his regime and strengthen his military capabilities, and a powerful ally in Russia to support his ambitions. So it's no wonder this newfound alliance has seemingly boosted Kim's confidence on the global stage and emboldened him to pursue more aggressive actions to achieve his long-term goals. With this in mind, Kim's decision to completely abandon the decades-long goal of reunifying the two Koreas makes perfect sense. But it's not just that Kim ended North Korea's policy of seeking a peaceful reunification with South Korea. He did a total 180. He declared South Korea the #1 enemy. With his new designation in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that he also instructed his people to be ready to occupy South Korea if a war broke out. His exact words were, "Our army should deal a deadly blow to thoroughly annihilate South Korea by mobilizing all the toughest means and potentialities without a moment's hesitation." Though to be fair, he also emphasized that his regime wouldn't unilaterally decide to start a war. However, he also has no intention of avoiding one. Of course, this isn't particularly reassuring, given that we're talking about a country infamous for employing a range of grey zone tactics. If Kim truly wanted to start a war without officially starting a war, he could use tactics like cyber attacks, sabotage, or asymmetric warfare to provoke a conflict while maintaining plausible deniability. It's also important to note that Kim's decision to abolish any reunification efforts has already moved from words to action. North Korea's supreme leader abolished government agencies that oversaw these reunification efforts, with the Committee for the Peaceful Reunification of Our Fatherland at the helm. But he didn't stop there. Never one for subtlety, Kim also decided to tear down the Arch of Reunification, a 9-story monument built on the outskirts of Pyongyang in 2001. As you can conclude from its unofficial name, this monument was to symbolize the goal of a unified Korean peninsula, spearheaded by Kim's father and grandfather. If recent satellite pictures are correct, this towering monument now lies in ruins, mirroring the shattered hopes of reconciliation and unity. Such a drastic break in the traditional talks from the North Korean leadership and the total abandonment of the idea of reunification can only mean one thing: a definitive end of an era of diplomacy. The new era that Kim has ushered in is undoubtedly one of tension, defiance, and conflict. But to navigate this new era, Kim needs more than just Russia's support. Judging by his first choice of ally, you can probably guess who the next one will be. Ding ding ding, it's China, always ready to unleash a storm of instability and conflict. Like Russia, China has its own major conflict to worry about, the ongoing tensions in the South China Sea. And like with Russia, North Korea could use these tensions to its advantage. You see, China and North Korea signed the Sino-North Korean Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance in 1961. This treaty binds both countries to provide military assistance if the other is attacked. However, China lacks a compelling reason to be pulled into a Korean war at this time. After all, such a war would end half a century of peace in East Asia, a period in which China has prospered immensely. However, if China was to be drawn into a war first, the tables would surely turn. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan would likely bring China and North Korea together, just like the invasion of Ukraine did for Russia and North Korea. This might even greenlight Kim's plans to find a way to start a war against South Korea. Throw a burgeoning coalition with Iran into the mix, and it becomes clear that this newly formed anti-West coalition is making some serious moves in Asia. Now you might wonder, what's the West doing about this? Where is the US in all of this? Well, the US also has issues of its own, namely the 2024 presidential election. The outcome of this election could also benefit North Korea, at least from Kim's point of view. Namely, he sees Trump's win as another chance to accomplish his primary strategic goal, to weaken the US-South Korean alliance and drive the US troops from the Korean peninsula. Side note, since North Korea has the proclivity to upset its enemies at their most sensitive political moments, we can probably expect some more nuclear tests as the election draws nearer. However, the US's domestic issues aren't the only factors that could potentially trigger a war on the Korean peninsula. So could the US's involvement in other major ongoing conflicts. Kim is gauging just how much influence the US has based on the conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, and East Asia. As Kim sees it, the US is incapable of forcing anyone to bear any notable consequences for aggression. As things stand, Russia hasn't been punished for its actions in Ukraine, at least not in any meaningful way. The same goes for Israel and its violent actions in Palestine. The lack of any serious consequences in these scenarios can only embolden Kim to believe that he too can act with impunity. But is there anything that can prevent him from doing so? Luckily, there is. Though Trump once referred to Kim Jong Un as a madman, even he probably won't risk his own survival for the sake of achieving his political goals. After all, a war against South Korea could likely mean the end of his regime, unless all the tiniest circumstances go his way, which is highly unlikely. However, it's also important to note that Carlin and Hecker warn against clinging to the belief that Kim fears that the US will wipe out his regime. If he continues to get bolder and perceives the US global influence as waning, his actions could become increasingly unpredictable and defy all calculations. And let's not fool ourselves, the US would also not have it easy if it were to intervene on the Korean peninsula. such an intervention would likely result in total wreckage stretching as far as the eyes can see. The only other thing that could prevent North Korea from attacking South Korea is its weak military. Whatever attack course this military was to take, by land, sea, or air, it would mostly have to rely on outdated equipment dating back to the days of the Soviet Union, which could significantly limit its success. Of course, even this argument might be flawed, as we've already mentioned that a nuclear attack is the likeliest scenario for a new Korean war. That's where North Korea's final anti-West ally, Iran, comes into play. The two countries have been illicitly trading weapons since the 1980s, as well as working on a joint missile development program. These efforts have only accelerated in recent times, as Iran has also become increasingly isolated on the global stage due to its involvement in the Gaza conflict, making it the perfect ally for North Korea, just like Russia and China. So no wonder the North Korea-Iranian nuclear collaboration is blooming. Though it's unclear just how many they have, North Korea purportedly operates at least 5 active uranium mining sites used to provide Iran with nuclear material. Additionally, North Korean scientists have worked in Iranian labs, while their Iranian counterparts have been physically present at every North Korean nuclear test to date. So it's safe to conclude that North Korea's growing nuclear arsenal can remove the last obstacle to a full-blown war against South Korea. But what do you think? Are the assessments that a war on the Korean peninsula is imminent overly sensational? Or are you confident that Kim Jong Un will put his words into action and wage a war against South Korea? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Now go and check out why North Korea is the hardest country to escape, or click this other video instead.